Hi guys. Tonight, I want to share a story about quiet dreams, the kind that whisper more than shout and take years to bloom. It's the kind of story that doesn't start with triumph or talent, but with small, steady footsteps. You'll meet a woman whose life never made headlines, but whose every choice was a quiet act of courage. Her name is Margaret Ellery. She never rushed, never demanded attention. But for 15 years, she saved every spare coin, patiently, quietly, toward something most people thought was a foolish dream. A little bookstore, nothing fancy, just a corner of warmth, filled with stories, for a town that had nearly forgotten the joy of turning pages. So if you've ever held a dream that felt too small or too slow, this story is for you. Let's begin. The town of Willowmere was the kind of place that stayed out of the way. It didn't grow. It didn't shrink. Just sat, gently forgotten by the highway, with its one blinking stoplight and leaning gas station that still sold candy for a quarter. Margaret had lived there all her life. She worked the early shift at Rosewood, retirement home, where time moved in slow loops and everything smelled faintly of tea and antiseptic. Her mornings began at 5:10 a.m., with the quiet click of the hallway lights and the soft rustle of slippers from those already awake. She changed bedsheets, lifted trays, listened to the same stories told a dozen times. And she did it all with a kindness that felt old-fashioned, even in a place already behind the times. No one knew much about her beyond her job. She was 52, lived alone, wore the same pair of sturdy shoes every season. People said she used to teach, English maybe. But the school had cut positions back when the paper mill closed. She never complained, just moved on. But every Tuesday, after her shift ended at 3, Margaret walked 4 blocks to the old bank building. It had been empty for years, just dusty windows and a rusted sign above the door. She'd stand there for a moment, gaze at the locked entrance like it was waiting for something. Then she'd turn slowly and head home. Most thought she was just reminiscing, but Margaret had a plan. It began 15 years ago, on a cold morning in October, when she'd sat in her kitchen with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, staring at a job rejection letter folded 3 times. The school had let her go the year before, and though she'd applied to dozens of places, librarian posts, front desk work, even a receptionist role at the auto shop, nothing stuck. That morning, as rain tapped gently on the roof, Margaret picked up an old notebook from the shelf. It was pale blue, the spine frayed, corners curling like dry leaves. And on the first page, she wrote 3 words. The Book Nook. It was the name of a dream she'd buried for decades. A bookstore. Not big or glossy, just quiet. A place with overstuffed chairs and teacups and handwritten signs. She'd thought about it when she was younger, in between teaching Chaucer to half-asleep 10th graders and organizing poetry nights in the school gym. But there was never enough money, and life always came first. Still, that morning, something settled in her. Not hope, not ambition, just resolve. She took an envelope from the drawer, labeled it Bookstore Fund, and placed inside the only cash she had, $4.17. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The years that followed were not glamorous. Margaret didn't earn much at the retirement home, just enough to cover rent, food, and bus fare. But every month, she tucked something away. $5, $10 if she skipped tea and toast at the corner cafe. She began ironing her own uniforms, stopped buying new clothes, clipped coupons with the precision of a surgeon. Friends asked why she never traveled, never upgraded anything. "Oh, I like simple things," she'd say, with a small smile. But behind her modesty lived discipline. She read every book about small business licensing, resale tax, used inventory. She called bookstores in other towns, pretending to be a student writing a paper. She browsed estate sales for shelving units and vintage signage. She even joined an online forum for indie shop owners, though she rarely posted. Each detail went into the notebook. Now on its 4th volume, each month the envelope thickened. Each Tuesday, she'd visit the old bank building, the one with tall windows and wide walls, and imagine where the shelves would go, where the reading lamp might sit, whether the dust could be scrubbed away. Most people would have given up. After all, 15 years is a long time to believe in something no one else sees. But Margaret didn't need the world to believe. She just needed to keep going. Still, the journey wasn't without bruises. One summer, just after her 60th birthday, the roof of her rental apartment collapsed during a thunderstorm. Insurance helped, but she had to spend nearly $1,500 to replace what was ruined, including her books, her notebooks, her entire envelope fund. The night it happened, she sat on the stoop of the apartment complex, arms folded around her knees, watching water drip from a rescued Jane Austen hardback that had been in her family for years. The pages were bloated, warped. It felt like grief. She thought about giving up. But then, she remembered what she told one of the residents at the retirement home, Mr. Lester, who often cried about his failing memory. "Sometimes we lose things," she had said gently, "but we don't lose the part of us that carried them." So, she began again. She bought a new envelope, started with $3 and a pressed leaf from the backyard tree, tucked inside for luck. The second beginning was harder. Her knees ached more. She had fewer years ahead of her. The price of rent had gone up, and so had groceries. But Margaret adjusted. She found part-time evening work at the town library, shelving books after closing. It was quiet, peaceful. And though she was exhausted some nights, she felt closer to her dream, closer to the shelves. Every week, she let herself buy one used book from the discard bin, 25 cents. It was her small indulgence, her whispered promise to the future. By now, she had a spreadsheet tracking expenses, savings, and licensing fees. The goal felt impossible some days. The total she needed, between renovations, permits, and a few months of rent, hovered around $22,000. By year 14, she had saved a little over $17,000, still short, but not broken. One day, a teenager named Amelia joined the retirement home as a volunteer. Pink hair, chipped nail polish, and earbuds always dangling. Margaret noticed how she never looked people in the eye. One afternoon, she found Amelia sitting alone in the break room, tears streaking her mascara. Without a word, Margaret sat beside her and handed her a tissue. After a few minutes, she said, quietly, "I used to cry in staff rooms too. But not because of anyone else. Just because I thought I was too late to become who I wanted to be." Amelia looked at her, confused. Margaret smiled gently. "Turns out we're never too late. We just take different paths." Amelia blinked. "What did you want to be?" Margaret paused. Then, for the first time in years, said it out loud. "I want to open a bookstore." It felt strange, exposed. But Amelia smiled through her tears. "That's the coolest thing I've ever heard. Sometimes just speaking a dream aloud is enough to make it real again. Because dreams need air. And maybe you feel the same way. Like your dream is taking too long, or the world forgot you. But you're not alone. You're not. And if this moment resonates with you, feel free to leave a like or subscribe to Quiet Strength. There are always more stories waiting here for you." Margaret's was just beginning. By the 15th year, Margaret's savings had reached just over $19,000. Not enough. Not yet. But enough to begin. The old bank building she'd visited every Tuesday was finally for sale. Not listed publicly, just a notice in the window, scrawled in faded ink. "Inquire at town office." Margaret stood in front of it that day longer than usual, her reflection merging with the dusty glass, arms clutching her coat against the wind. She didn't move for several minutes. Inside, her chest something stirred, not excitement, not fear, just a trembling readiness. That afternoon, she called the number. The building's owner, an older man named Glenn Turner, didn't expect a buyer. He said he was mostly listing it out of obligation, figuring it would stay empty a while longer. It Needs work, he warned. Roof leaks. Wiring's outdated. Basement floods in spring. Margaret nodded. I'd like to see it anyway. When she stepped through the door the next day, a flurry of dust spun up to meet her. The floor creaked beneath her steps, echoing through the bare chamber. A tangle of cobwebs hung from the light fixtures. The air smelled of mildew and paper long gone. But she saw it. She saw it the way a gardener sees wild land and imagines tomatoes, the way a potter sees mud and thinks of bowls. She saw shelves, painted pale green, a reading chair by the window, lampshades warmed by amber bulbs, a bell above the door, maybe even a chalkboard easel outside for handwritten quotes. She closed her eyes and stood perfectly still. This was it. I'd like to make an offer, she said softly. It wasn't smooth. The offer was modest, barely above $14,000. Glenn hesitated. He could get more, probably, if he waited. But he didn't, because something in Margaret's eyes reminded him of his mother, who had once run a little candy shop out of their porch when money was tight. All right, he said, after 2 long weeks. But you handle all the repairs yourself. Margaret shook his hand with both of hers. Her fingers trembled for an hour afterward. Now came the hard part. The remaining savings, less than $5,000, would need to cover renovations, permits, inspections, and every last book. She didn't have enough. Not nearly. So, she made a new notebook. This one she labeled Barebones Plan. No hired contractors, no designer signs, no custom shelves. She found a second-hand toolbox online, watched hours of home repair videos, borrowed paintbrushes from the library staff. In early spring, she began. Every morning, she worked at Rosewood. Every evening, she rode her bike 2 miles to the store, changed into old jeans, and started scraping the floors. Some nights, she only had the strength to sweep a single corner. Other nights, she stayed until 1 a.m., sanding wood, caulking window seams, soaking old doorknobs in vinegar. She learned how to seal water damage, how to install light fixtures, how to stretch every dollar. The town began to notice. People slowed down when they passed, peered through the glass, and then one day a small envelope was slid under the door. Inside, $30 and a note in slanted handwriting. I hope you make it. This town needs a place like that. Emma Margaret didn't know who M was, but she wept. Not out of gratitude, out of recognition. Somebody else saw it now too. She wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few weeks, more notes appeared. Anonymous donations, a few tools, a stack of books labeled "For Your Shelves." Amelia, the teenager from Rosewood, came by one afternoon with her brother and a hammer. I watch tutorials, she said. I can help. Margaret smiled. You sure? No, Amelia replied. But I think you're supposed to learn as you go. So they did. Together. Every week, someone else joined. A retired teacher painted a mural in the children's corner. A quiet man from the post office offered to repair the front steps. A mother of 3 brought homemade curtains. The building transformed slowly, like a photograph developing in gentle light. Not perfect, but loved. And love is the thing that makes a room into a haven. By autumn, the shelves were up. Second-hand, mismatched, slightly warped, but strong. Margaret labeled each section in her own handwriting. Fiction, poetry, travel, memoir, children's corner. She couldn't afford a point-of-sale system, so she built a ledger instead. Cash only. She designed a simple stamp that read, "The Book, Nook, Willowmere," and practiced pressing it onto brown paper bags. On October 3rd, the same date she'd written in her first notebook 15 years ago, Margaret unlocked the front door to the bookstore for the first time. The bell above. The door chimed once. She stood behind the counter. Alone. The windows were clean. The lights were soft. Music played from an old record player, and the air smelled like paper, hope, and lemon oil. The first customer came in at 10:12 a.m., a boy named Ezra, 9 years old. He had $2.45 in coins and wanted a book about dinosaurs. Margaret knelt beside him and helped him choose one from the used stack. "It's a little worn," she said. "But that just means someone else loved it first." Ezra grinned. And just like that, the store had its first memory. The weeks that followed were quiet. Some days only 3 customers came. Some days, none. But Margaret didn't panic. This wasn't about profit. This was about presence. She made tea for visitors, shared cookies she baked herself. She listened to people, really listened. A woman mourning her mother. A man who hadn't read in 20 years. A child who thought books were boring until Margaret read one aloud in the voice of a talking hedgehog. Each person left with more than a book. They left with warmth, connection, silence that comforted instead of isolating. And Margaret? She sat behind the counter every day, one hand resting lightly on the surface of her notebook. She didn't smile out of pride. She smiled because this, finally, was what breathing felt like. She had waited so long. Given so much, and now she was exactly where she belonged. It was winter now. The bookstore was always warmer than the air outside, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The old radiator hissed gently in the mornings, and Margaret had knitted thick covers for the chair cushions. A small kettle sat on a warmer behind the counter, always ready for a visitor who needed something to hold. Outside, snow pressed softly against the windows. Inside, the stories on the shelves stood like quiet companions, waiting. Margaret added new books when she could. Used finds from estate sales, donations, and the occasional splurge from the clearance rack at the regional bookstore an hour away. She chose them carefully, like old friends returning home. Some days were still slow. But then came a Wednesday morning in late January. A class from the elementary school had arranged a field trip. A literacy excursion, the permission slip, had read. 22 second graders filed into the little shop, their boots squeaking, cheeks pink from the cold. Margaret had arranged a small display just for them. Picture books about animals, space, kindness. A worn rocking chair in the back. A bowl of tiny bookmarks with glittering stars on the ends. She read aloud for nearly an hour. The children didn't fidget. They leaned in, listened, asked questions with soft voices and wide eyes. And when they left, the teacher pressed Margaret's hand. "This matters," she whispered. "You're doing something real here." That evening, Margaret didn't go straight home. She sat in the reading chair long after the sun had vanished, the bell long silenced, the quiet pressed against her like a blanket. She allowed herself one page from a poetry book, then another, then another. That night, as she closed the store, she whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular, to the shelves, to the dust, to the slow years that brought her here. But not every day was soft. In early March, the boiler gave out. The store was cold, too cold for customers. Margaret wore gloves indoors, wrapped herself in scarves, and kept a sign on the front door that read, "Open, but chilly. Tea's still warm." The repair estimate was over $1,200, money she didn't have. For the first time since opening, Margaret considered closing for a while. Just a few weeks, until she could save up again. But when she came in one morning, she found a folded piece of paper on the counter. It was a receipt, paid in full. The note attached read, "For the warmth you've given this town." Anonymous, her throat tightened. She turned to the window, blinking hard at the falling snow, and whispered, "Not alone. Never alone again." By April, the book nook was becoming a habit for the town. Teenagers came after school to read quietly or help stock shelves. Retired folks brought coffee and lingered over memoirs. Children stopped by to tell Margaret about their dreams. A new ritual emerged. Story Saturdays. Every weekend at 11 a.m., Margaret would read a short story or a chapter from a children's classic. Sometimes the parents stayed too, pretending they were just waiting, but never actually leaving. And slowly, something else bloomed. People began to bring their own stories. A widower brought a stack of his wife's favorite gardening, books wrapped in a ribbon. A young woman shared her handmade poetry zines. A shy boy donated a sketchbook full of comic strips he'd drawn, saying quietly, "You can put it on the shelf if you want." Margaret gave them a space, not just for books, but for being seen. It was never loud, no big grand opening, no viral photos, no press coverage, just word of mouth and word of heart. In May, Margaret received a letter from a nearby town's librarian, inviting her to speak at their local literary day. She almost said no, she wasn't a speaker. She didn't like crowds, she wasn't anyone special, but Amelia insisted. "You don't have to perform," she said. "Just tell them what you built, and why." So Margaret went. She wore a plain sweater, wrote her thoughts in a notebook, and stood behind the microphone with trembling hands. The room fell quiet as she spoke, slowly, softly. She didn't tell them how hard it was. She told them how full it became. "Some dreams," she said, "aren't about changing the world. They're about keeping a corner of it warm. That's enough." When she sat down, there was silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, but steady. That night, as she sat alone in her borrowed guest room, Margaret opened her notebook and wrote, "I used to think I was too late. But I was just early to a dream that needed time." That summer, 2 girls who'd been regular visitors asked if they could help run a little book club. Margaret didn't hesitate. She cleared a corner of the store, rearranged a few chairs, hung a string of paper stars. They met every Thursday. Sometimes 5 people came, sometimes 12, sometimes just 1. Margaret didn't mind. Every person mattered. Every person was a chapter. And now, she wasn't writing the story alone. In late August, a man in his 30s entered the shop. Tall, dark coat, a nervous energy. Margaret greeted him gently. He didn't browse, just stood for a while, then approached the counter. "You don't remember me?" he said. Margaret tilted her head, smiling politely. "I was one of your students, 10th grade. You taught us to kill a mockingbird." Her eyes widened. Slowly, a memory surfaced. A quiet boy in the back row, always doodling in his notebook. "I never liked reading," he continued, "but you didn't make me feel dumb for that. You let me draw my thoughts instead." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim hardcover. "I became a graphic novelist," he said. "This is my 3rd book. I wanted you to have it." Margaret took the book in both hands. The cover was soft to the touch. Inside, a dedication. "For the first person who saw me." That night, Margaret placed the book in a special spot on the front shelf. She didn't cry, but her heart ached with a kind of quiet fullness that has no words. The days rolled on. Customers came and went, and in a town where time moved slow, the book nook became a gentle pulse, steady, warm, alive. And Margaret, once invisible, had quietly become part of 100 people's stories, maybe more, but she didn't count. She just opened the door each morning with the same soft whisper, "Welcome in." The 4th autumn since the store's opening came with gold-tipped leaves and early twilight. Margaret began setting a lamp in the window each evening, a small stained glass piece she'd found years ago at a garage sale and never had the heart to throw away. Its glow painted soft color onto the sidewalk, like an invitation whispered in light. Locals now called the Book Nook the heart of Main Street. And though the shelves still held their same uneven shape and the old counter creaked when leaned upon, the place had grown something stronger than polish: belonging. Margaret never spoke of success. She rarely spoke of herself at all. But if you asked her what mattered most, she'd pause, press a hand to her chest, and say, "People come here not just to find stories. They come to remember they still have one." In late October, Margaret received a letter from the local college. They had heard about her story from a student, Amelia, now a sophomore studying early childhood education. The school's community arts board wanted to honor her with a small Keeper of Story award at their fall ceremony. Margaret reread the letter 5 times, then folded it gently and tucked it into her notebook. She didn't tell anyone, but on the day of the ceremony, she wore her best scarf and rode the bus to the campus auditorium. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the front, heart thumping louder than the applause. She didn't prepare a speech, just stood at the microphone and said, "I built a bookstore because I needed a place to feel whole. Turns out, so did other people." There was no dramatic bow, no fanfare, just a small nod. And then she returned to Willowmere, opened the shop the next morning, and poured her first cup of tea. Nothing changed, and everything did. Winter came. Early that year. The first snow dusted the sidewalk in mid-November. Margaret spent the evening hanging tiny paper lanterns across the front window and placing pine-scented bookmarks in a tin near the register. Children made snow angels outside. Teenagers dropped by for warmth and cocoa. But one morning, just before opening, Margaret stumbled while stepping down from the ladder after adjusting a sign. Her ankle gave way and she fell hard. No one was there. She sat for a moment on the cold floor, breath shallow, pain curling up her leg. She reached for the counter, pulled herself up, and winced, sprained. Badly. A ride to the clinic confirmed it. The doctor advised rest. Minimum 2 weeks off her feet. Margaret blinked. 2 weeks? The shop had never closed. Not once since the first day. She returned home, leg braced, feeling heavy with frustration. That evening, as she sat with her foot propped up on a cushion, a knock came at her door. It was Amelia. Behind her stood 2 other familiar faces. Tom from the library, and Sarah, a high school senior who had once written her college essay sitting on the children's carpet in the nook. They held bags of supplies, a thermos of tea, and a folded, handwritten sign, "Caretakers of the Nook, temporary staff." "Margaret," Amelia said gently, "we've got it covered." And for the next 14 days, the book nook remained open. Not just functioning, but glowing. The bell chimed as usual. The tea was warm. Story Saturdays continued. When Margaret returned, still limping slightly, she stood at the doorway and listened. Inside, laughter, quiet voices, the smell of paper and cinnamon. She wasn't needed. She was loved. That December, the community held its first story night. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought soup. People sat on the floor, chairs, steps. They read aloud, poems, journal entries, short stories. One boy even read the letter he'd written to Santa. When it was Margaret's turn, she didn't read. She simply said, "This bookstore was born because I believed in slow things, and I still do." That night, a teenager from the high school newspaper asked if he could interview her. He asked about her biggest regret. She thought for a long time, then said, "That I waited so long to trust that small things matter." He nodded, then asked his second question. "What do you hope people feel when they walk into your shop?" She smiled. "Safe." After the holidays, a man in a business suit entered the store. He looked out of place, too polished, too brisk. He introduced himself as a developer interested in bringing modern retail opportunities to the town. He'd heard of the Book Nook's popularity and wondered if she'd ever consider selling. "We could give it a bigger space," he said. "More foot traffic, a brand refresh, online inventory, franchise potential." Margaret listened. She nodded, then very kindly said, "No, thank you." He blinked. "May I ask why?" She didn't answer immediately, just ran her hand along the edge of the nearest shelf, then said, "This place isn't about growth, it's about grounding." He left without another word. Margaret continued waking before dawn, still rode her bike when the weather allowed, still spent every Sunday afternoon alone with her notebook, reflecting on the week. Each Sunday entry began the same way. What was quiet, but important? She answered honestly, sometimes with joy, sometimes with sorrow. Some days, the store was empty. Some days, the tea burned. Some days, the register came up short, but each page ended with the same conclusion: still worth it. One evening in March, a customer returned a book late. He apologized, then handed her a small card. "Your late fee," he joked. Inside the card: "Thank you for reminding me that healing doesn't have to be loud. Your shop saved me more than once." Margaret read the card 3 times, then placed it in her bottom drawer, beside a photo of her parents and a dried pressed leaf from her first savings envelope. There were no signs of fame, no milestones, no viral posts, just a town that no longer felt invisible, and a woman who had never given up. That spring, a new generation began discovering the Nook. Children who used to crawl now ran to the shelves. Teenagers once too shy to speak now asked for recommendations. Margaret sometimes caught herself looking around the room with quiet disbelief. It wasn't glamorous. It was better. It was real. Every dented chair, every uneven floorboard, every moment, shared over a book. It was hers, and now it belonged to everyone. Spring settled slowly over Willowmere that year. The air smelled of earth and soft blossoms, and sunlight stretched a little longer each day. The Book Nook's front windows, always gently dusted with fingerprints and nose smudges from curious little ones, now shimmered with light during the golden hours. Margaret began opening the door in the mornings to let the breeze carry the scent of fresh grass into the shop. She placed a wicker basket just inside the entrance, marked "Take 1, Pocket Poems." Inside were slips of recycled paper, each with a short verse written by local readers. Some rhymed, some didn't. All were honest. A small ritual bloomed. Children would pick a poem and whisper it to themselves while they wandered the aisles. Teenagers folded them into notebooks. A few older customers added their own on return visits. Quiet art, shared gently. Margaret never said a word about it, but she watched every time someone took one and smiled. One Thursday morning in April, she received a letter in cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. It was from the city's education board. They wanted to recognize the Book Nook as a community literacy partner, part of a quiet statewide initiative to celebrate local, independent spaces, fostering reading and reflection. There was no cash prize, no gala, just a seal to place in the window. A gesture. Margaret accepted, of course. When the seal arrived in the mail, she sat with it for a long time before placing it in the lower left corner of the window. Discreet, unobtrusive. You wouldn't notice it unless you looked closely. Just how she liked it. Later that afternoon, a group of second graders wandered in for a surprise reading hour, their teacher whispering apologies for the unannounced visit. Margaret waved them in, placed a hand on the rocking chair's arm, and opened a story about a little girl who lived in a forest with nothing but a satchel of seeds and her grandfather's voice. When she finished reading, a quiet boy with dark hair raised his hand and asked, "Did she ever grow the whole forest?" Margaret looked at him gently. She did, but not all at once, one tree at a time. It was true of the Book Nook, too. Margaret had stopped thinking in years. She now measured in chapters. Every day was a new page. Not always joyful, but always real. There were small frustrations, missing inventory, back-ordered titles, a flickering light that wouldn't stay fixed. And yet, each issue folded into the rhythm of her days like a comma in a long sentence. Annoying, perhaps, but not enough to ruin the story. The slow, steady growth of the shop mirrored something deeper in Margaret. She wasn't just building a business anymore. She was becoming something she'd never dared imagine. A fixture. People began to reference her in directions. "Oh, it's 2 blocks past Margaret's place. She'll know what book you need." She helped my daughter find poetry when she couldn't find her own words. Even her posture changed. Still quiet, still modest, but no longer shrinking. She took up her space now. Not loudly, but fully. And then, one evening in late May, something she hadn't expected happened. Man appeared at closing time, disheveled, eyes red-rimmed. He hovered by the door until she invited him in. He didn't speak at first, just stood in front of the biography section with trembling hands. Finally, he approached the counter. "I'm sorry," he said. Margaret tilted her head, unsure. I left, he added. 20 years ago. I didn't come back. You sent letters. I never answered. Her breath caught. Elliot? She asked. Her brother nodded slowly. I read about you. Online. A blog someone wrote about the shop. I saw your name. I came to say I was sorry. For a long time, Margaret said nothing. Then she stepped around the counter. Her shoes creaked softly on the old floor, and she reached out slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. You're here, she said. That's enough. They sat for 2 hours that night. No big reconciliations. No emotional outbursts. Just shared tea. Shared quiet. She showed him the old notebooks, the first envelope, the sketches, the broken chair she still kept near the front door because it reminds me how I started. He asked if she'd been lonely. She thought for a long time before answering. Sometimes. But not in the way people think. I wasn't waiting for something. I was walking toward it. He stayed in town for a few days. They didn't become inseparable. But something old was gently mended, like a page reattached with thin thread. Summer bloomed in full. Customers came and went in sandals and sun hats. Margaret began hosting outdoor readings on the small bench near the window. Sometimes she left chalk for kids to draw on the pavement. Their drawings, stars, cats, open books, added color to the gray. One particularly warm Thursday, she opened a handwritten envelope. It was from a young woman named Joelle, who had moved away a year ago. The letter read, Dear Margaret, the Nook saved me during the loneliest year of my life. You never asked questions, just made space. I still remember the smell of lemon and paper and whatever tea was in the mug that day. I hope you know you've built more than a store. You've built memory. Love always. Joelle. Margaret folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer. As all the others. She didn't need awards, or recognition, or even thanks. But those words, they were bricks. Bricks that held up the walls she'd built with her bare hands and her heart. That July, the town hosted its first book walk. Dozens of small businesses participated, but the Book Nook was the anchor. People followed story pages hung along storefronts, ending at her door, where Margaret greeted them not as a business owner, but as a guide, a steward, a quiet celebrator of all that words could hold. At the end of the walk, a local musician played soft tunes in the corner. Tea was passed around, and Margaret, without planning it, read aloud a passage from one of her favorite books. We carry our dreams not because they're easy, but because they are ours. And when the world seems too fast, we build something slow. When she looked up, eyes around the room glistened, and she realized her dream was no longer just hers. It belonged to them now, to all of them. That night, she didn't write in her notebook. She just sat in her reading chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, listening, not to silence, but to fullness. The end of summer in Willowmere was always gentle. Not a dramatic shift, but a soft, gradual cooling. The kind that whispered change rather than declared it. Golden leaves clung longer to the trees that year, as if the town itself wasn't quite ready to let go. At the Book Nook, Margaret began her usual routine of rotating the front table books. Autumn poems, stories about change, paperbacks worn in the best way. She tied small ribbons around new arrivals, added a jar of cinnamon sticks near the counter. One morning, she found a child asleep on the reading rug, clutching a book about foxes. His mother, breathless, came rushing in minutes later. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, clearly embarrassed. "I told him we'd just stop in for 5 minutes." Margaret only smiled. "Don't worry," she said softly. "Books are one of the few places it's safe to fall asleep." She handed the mother a cup of tea, and they stayed a while longer. In late September, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from a publishing house, a small one, niche. They had heard about the Book Nook from a visiting writer who'd passed through town. They were compiling a collection of essays titled Small Places, Big Stories, a tribute to independent bookshops and the people who kept them alive. Would Margaret consider writing an essay? At first, she declined. She didn't think of herself as a writer. She was just someone who opened a door. But later that week, as she sipped tea in her favorite chair and reread one of the old notebooks, she thought, maybe this story isn't just mine. Maybe someone else out there is saving pennies in an envelope. Or standing in front of a dusty building thinking, who am I to believe this could work? Maybe they need to hear it. So she wrote, slowly, gently, just like she'd lived it. She titled the essay, The Worth of Waiting. By early October, the store marked its 5th anniversary. There was no banner, no sale, no announcements, just a normal day, and a handwritten sign on the chalkboard easel out front. 5 years of stories. Thank you for adding yours. Throughout the day, customers came quietly. Many brought notes, flowers, or shared memories. Someone left a sketch of the shop tucked into the returns bin. A child drew a crayon portrait of Miss Margaret and her magic book place. At sunset, Margaret stood at the doorway and watched the sky soften into coral and ash. She thought of all the years behind her, all the quiet moments no one had seen, the nights of loneliness, the tears shed into teacups, the slow, faithful march of saving, sanding, believing, and now this, not fame, this. Not fortune, but a bookstore. Alive. That winter, the heater broke again. The roof leaked a little. She caught the flu and had to close for 2 days. But the regulars brought soup. Amelia ran things while Margaret rested. Someone even knit a new cushion for the reading chair. The store didn't fall apart. It adapted. It had become what she always hoped it would be, self-sustaining kindness. On a quiet morning in January, Margaret woke with pain in her hip that wouldn't ease. The doctor confirmed arthritis. Manageable but real. She'd have to slow down. She didn't panic. She trained a new part-time helper. She reduced hours by 30 minutes, let herself sit more often. She didn't stop. She adjusted. And people understood, because the Book Nook had taught them how to live slowly too. Years passed like chapters. Margaret's hair silvered, her steps slowed, but her presence never faded. People brought her pie, shared dreams, sat beside her just to sit. She became, in the words of one child, the story lady who lives in the bookstore and makes the whole town feel calm. Margaret never aimed to be anything more than herself, and yet, she became a lighthouse. On her 70th birthday, the community held a small gathering. Not a surprise. Just a quiet evening where people read aloud their favorite passages from books they'd found at the Nook. Margaret sat near the back, cheeks flushed with emotion. She didn't say much, but when asked if she had anything to share, she simply said, I think dreams don't always need to roar to be real. Sometimes they whisper, and that's enough. The room went quiet. Someone wept softly in the back. That night she walked home slower than usual. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. She paused outside the store, looked at the window, and then at the stars above. And for a moment, she felt a sensation, so full, so deep. It felt like a page turning inside her, the kind you don't want to end, but you know is leading somewhere beautiful. Margaret Ellery's story reminds us of the quiet power of perseverance. Not the loud kind that wins medals or headlines, but the kind that shows up every day, even when no one's looking. The kind that saves dollar by dollar, dream by dream, not because it's easy, but because it's true. For 15 years, Margaret walked toward a vision no one else could see. Through hardship, solitude, and slow seasons of doubt, she never rushed. She never asked the world to notice. She simply kept going. And in doing so, she created more than a bookstore. She created a haven, a place for weary people to rest, a place where books weren't just sold, they were shared. A space where connection was built page by page. We often think success means fast results and big gestures. But Margaret's life shows us another way. That building something real takes time. That consistency, care, and kindness can change a corner of the world more deeply than ambition ever could. So if you're holding onto a dream that feels too small, too slow, too far away, remember this story. Remember Margaret. And trust that quiet strength can carry you farther than you know, because some dreams aren't loud, they're just yours, and that's enough.